Howdy, y'all. Welcome to a new era for the Kentuckian. I'm so glad that you've decided to join us for this video. I do hope that you shall be patient as I get into the swing of regularly recording videos instead of just the podcast and all the different things that go on with that. I'm working in a different space. I've got some other stuff that I'm going to have to figure out. I've got some things jury-rigged for these episodes that I'm recording today. So there's a lot that I'm going to have to sort of figure out as I go along. Audio quality may not be quite what it normally is on the podcast. We'll see. I'm kind of playing it by ear right now. I've got a lot of things going on, and there's just a lot to figure out with getting the video set up the way that I like it. So I hope that you'll be patient with me in that. I'm very excited about what we're going to be doing with the Kentuckian, about how we're upgrading, and hopefully we'll have a much larger reach as we grow and move along. As you all know, this last Tuesday was the day of the midterm elections for 2022. There were many eyes upon this election, and there were many predictions, many assumptions about this election. People on both sides of the political spectrum came away disappointed as well. And there are many different factors to consider when you look at the results of the election. But I'd like to give you a general perspective on this most recent election that I hope will, one, help you make sense of the results from the election, and two, give you some hope and motivation, because while I know that people on both sides were disappointed, it was not a total loss. And I hope that we're able to kind of get that across, that it wasn't all bad. But probably the most obvious thing that my listeners would think of when they think of the elections is that it was no red tsunami, as some people were predicting. I'm going to be frank. I didn't realize what many people were expecting. I didn't realize that many people were expecting for Republicans to dominate virtually every state. As one friend of mine I was speaking to after the election put it, like when Reagan was elected. I didn't realize that that was being predicted. I don't really pay much attention to a lot of the political talking heads that people may go and listen to. And the ones that I do listen to, and there are a few that I regularly try and see their content, listen to what they've got to say, and so on. The ones that I do listen to weren't really making those sorts of predictions for the election. So that was something where I kind of missed it. I didn't realize that that was something that a lot of y'all were expecting. I was expecting a solid performance by Republicans, hopefully gaining some ground in some of the key areas that have been what you might call battleground states. I don't really like that terminology, but it does communicate the idea that I'm trying to get across. You know, I was thinking it was going to be all right. It was going to be solid. Now, I do realize that not all the races are determined yet, and some of them are still very much up in the air. The Herschel Walker, the Georgia Senate race with Herschel Walker and Warnock is going to a runoff election in December, so hopefully that'll go well. And there's some others where they're still counting votes, mail-in votes, and I don't know. It's kind of a mess, especially in Arizona. But by and large, we know basically what's happened with the election. There are definitely still a few questions out there, but the overall results are going to come out to pretty much the same. And I want us to understand that Tuesday was by no means a loss for Republicans or for the conservative movement in general. But it wasn't nearly what a lot of folks were expecting, as I said. Now, I would suggest that expecting the kind of outcome that apparently some people had was probably not realistic, but we'll get into why in a few moments. Also, I hope you're not too distracted by me looking down at my notes. Again, I'm getting used to this format, so I may kind of adjust how I do this. But if you see me glancing down, I'm probably looking at my notes. So a big point that I want to try and get across for this episode is that I don't want to be too negative. I want you all to understand that overall, honestly, I was relatively pleased with the election results, all things considered. I don't think that it was a total loss or a disaster by any means, and I don't want people to be too pessimistic about the results of the election. There were many good things that did come from the election. Joe Biden's power is effectively hamstrung. I know there's still some debates about who's going to hold the Senate mainly, who the majority is actually going to go to. Either way, it's going to be a razor-thin majority, whoever it goes to. That's going to really help kind of limit the power of the Democrat Party and of Joe Biden in being able to push his agenda as he's been doing. Even now, it's still been limited, just it may be more limited, hopefully, Lord willing. Another thing, Republicans made advances in really most areas, even if they didn't win. So even in places that did end up going Democrat were razor thin. There were tighter margins where normally it would have been a Democrat landslide. Those sorts of things were very common in the election Tuesday. In areas that were already red, that were already Republican and more conservative, the margins continue to grow larger. We have many cases of Republicans winning by double digits in some areas when 8 or even 4 years ago, a Republican victory may have been doubtful, much less would anybody would have predicted a landslide win or expected a landslide win. The areas that are conservative, that are red, that do have some sort of that kind of general conservative foundation are becoming more red. They're becoming more conservative. This leads to a concentration of force, of political force. And what that means when you're able to concentrate, Republican, conservative, whatever term you want to use, when you're able to concentrate those forces, what that's going to lead to is more effective, usable force. Workable force. Think about it this way. And this is just one example because there's a concept in military strategy called a concentration of force. It doesn't matter how big your army is, if you can bring more forces, if you can bring more power to bear at a specific instance, say a specific battle, you're going to win even if the overall enemy army is larger. That's a very basic description of the idea of concentration of force. And that's very similar to what I'm talking about here. And this is not accurate numbers. This is just to make this point. If there are 300 million people in this country, okay, just for example, it's closer to 340 million last time I checked, and say that 150 million of those people, half of the people of that 300 million population are conservative, but they're spread out over all 50 states. Well, realistically, the workable power that they have, the power that they actually hold to be able to change policy, to be able to affect cultural issues, that sort of thing on state, local, and national levels is all quite limited. Because even though you have half the people that are Republican, they're spread out where half the people are Democrat too, right? Half the people are going to oppose certain things, half the people are going to not. And that's part of the reason where you get some of these really close races, because there might be a lot of conservatives, but there's just about as many Democrats, and so it really comes down to the wire on who's going to win. But if you have 75 million conservatives, half of that number, a quarter of the total population, but they're only spread out over 15 states, much less than, or significantly less than a quarter of the number of states. You now have a conservative power base. You can actually get consistent conservative policies and values because the force of the conservatives are concentrated, even if in total they're not as great. And I just realized that my math was not correct. Not out of 15, say 10 states. If you have 75 million people divided over 10 states, because I don't want somebody to do the math and say, well, you don't know what you're talking about. That's my bad. I was doing a little mental math as I was talking about it. So say those 75 million spread out over 10 states. And of course, that's not even a perfect example. It's just very theoretical, right? The populations in different states are very different. The population in California is far different than the population in Kentucky. And that would have a big effect on, the concentration of people. If they're spread out evenly over those 50 states, does that mean per population? That sort of stuff, right? It's just to help illustrate that idea of concentration of force. And when we see these Republican states during the election that are going redder and redder, that more and more, or the margins are getting larger, significantly larger from the last election, from the election before that, you're concentrating conservative political force. You're able to get more done practically, both on the local level, on the state level, and on the national level too, although it might be slightly more limited, because you now have a lot more people in the same area that are voting for basically the same thing. So I hope that makes sense. That's definitely a good thing that we are seeing from this election. There were many fantastic governor wins, and I know there's still at least one big one up in the air with Kari Lake in Arizona. Hopefully that'll turn out well. We still don't know yet. One thing about governor races, from my understanding, if there's any indication as to how a presidential election may go, the governor elections may be an indicator of that. There's no great indicator from other elections of how the presidential election is going to go, but governors are probably the strongest indicator out of any of them. So that's a good thing. And just having more conservative, more or less, I realize not all Republicans actually do very much, but having more conservative leaders in a position as significant as the governor in a state does make a big difference. Having a governor or chief executive of a state that's willing to do what needs to be done has a large effect on local and state affairs, which has a large effect on everything. Never forget that. And again, in general, and this is going to be mainly in Republican states, but I've been hearing some and even more battleground or even Democrat states that Republicans are winning a significant number of smaller offices, and maybe smaller judicial positions and legislative positions and that sort of thing. You might ask, when you think about those smaller elections, and I kind of alluded to this a moment ago, when you think about, well, what's the big deal if it's a smaller election? Well, smaller elections, the local, the state elections, have a big effect on kind of the everyday ground, on the ground, first line kind of work. And that's absolutely true. It tends to have a much more direct effect on you personally, aside from things like taxes and stuff like that on a federal level. But also that means that work like election integrity work, that kind of legislation, those kind of things getting cleaned up, more of that is going to be able to get done when you have Republicans in these quote-unquote smaller positions or less significant positions, definitely less national positions. Just progress in general on the state level of stemming the tide of evil and dealing with election integrity questions. And I do have to be very careful talking about that. I'm not saying that per se, for the sake of YouTube, that there was questions about election integrity, but there is a place for legislation just in general. I hope you all understand YouTube is very, very tight on those sorts of things when you're talking about elections. And I'm not saying there was, but if there was any kind of election integrity questions, and again, I'm not saying that there is for the purposes of YouTube. But progress can really be done on the state and local levels, and we don't need to ever bat an eye at that. In Tennessee, they're doing a lot of stuff with transgender things and the way that they've been working on children and trying to get these surgeries and hormone treatments and stuff for children. And the states can do a lot to kind of stop that stuff, nip it in the bud, especially temporarily and sometimes even long-term, depending on the situation, depending on the specific legal context and that sort of thing. Abortion was a good example of that because even though it was protected by federal law, whether that law was legitimate is a different story, but even though it was protected by federal law, there was a lot that state and local politicians, state and local legislatures could do to limit access to abortion. And so there was good that was done there, even though they couldn't outright ban it. Another good thing that happened from the election, if you're familiar with Louder with Crowder, he is the largest conservative commentator show in the country, bar none, not even Daily Wire or anything. Louder with Crowder was suspended from YouTube 2 weeks before the election with no real reason given, and YouTube has pulled stuff like this, especially on them before, not really giving a reason, reinstating them after a significant event, getting a little tongue-tied there. In this case, the election, and then they'll put them back on, a few days after or whatever, and try and limit their influence when it comes to elections and those sorts of things. But they also stream on Rumble, and they had an election live stream for this election. They had done one for the election before as well. I think they did one for the election before that, although I'm not 100% sure. So they just had their election live stream on Rumble. And again, if I've mentioned this on the regular, I say the regular, not regular anymore, on just the audio podcast, just the podcast, that Rumble is a great YouTube alternative. And of course, you might be watching this video on Rumble. I hope that you are. But anything has had a hard time competing with YouTube. Rumble has probably made the most strides of anybody, but they still have a ways to go. However, with this Louder with Crowder election live stream on Rumble, it was the largest election live stream off of big tech and traditional media, so not including YouTube or the CNN, the kind of mainstream media sources. The largest election live stream off of big tech ever in history. They had hundreds of thousands of viewers at a time. I actually watched a significant part of it. And as of Thursday evening, so I'm recording this on Saturday after I checked this on Thursday when I was working on some of the scripts and stuff. As of Thursday evening, they had well over 3.3 million total views for that election live stream. And I'm not 100% sure, but if I remember correctly, it was around 3 million on election night. So that wasn't just people watching it afterwards. It was an extremely successful live stream, and it has successfully demonstrated, without a doubt, that other platforms are viable for use for things like election live streams and other kind of content. If they could get that many people on at one time, that many people on a live stream, it shows that it can work. And so really, big tech's monopoly just received a big old nail in the coffin on Tuesday. And that is something that is key in saving this country moving forward. So that's another great thing that happened from the election. I think in general, kind of to sum it all up, we have a very solid stage set for the extremely important 2024 presidential election. And that's what I think we really need to focus on. It's not to minimize the effects of an election like this. Midterms are very important, but all things considered, it's helping to set the stage for what I would consider a more important election, and that is the presidential election. So that's kind of the general good things that I see. I really don't want us to be pessimistic. I think there were good things that happened. It was not a horrible election. Was it what we wanted? Not necessarily, right? Would I have been glad if there had been far more Republicans just wiping out all the competition? That'd be fantastic. Although I do think there's actually some considerations why it may be a somewhat good thing that it wasn't a total red tsunami. I went and hit my mic there. But we'll get into that in a second. There are still very many concerns, and I want to be realistic about that as well. And I want to talk about some of that. Now, again, I'm not saying that there was evidence of any voter inconsistencies for the sake of YouTube. Wink, wink. I can speak freely about this sort of thing on Rumble, but YouTube, again, is very draconian on these things. I do have to be careful. I may do a special episode on this subject exclusively on Rumble, so I can speak more freely about it. I haven't decided 100% for sure yet, but I may be doing that. So, that is one of the concerns. Maybe one of the concerns. I'm not saying for sure that it is for the purposes of YouTube. I'm not saying that there was necessarily concern when it comes to voting integrity for the purposes of YouTube. But I hope you all can understand what I'm getting at when I'm talking about that. So there, maybe not a concern. I'm not saying technically that it is, just for YouTube. I don't want to get shut down on my first video. Of course, there are still some close races, as I mentioned a little bit ago. I do believe that it's logical. This is just a general thing. I'm not, for the purposes of YouTube, I'm not specifically saying this about this election. I'm just saying in general that I believe it's logical to expect that election results come back within a day of the election, except in the most unusual and rare cases. But that's something this issue is something we need to be aware of. Just hopefully I don't get banned. Also, and perhaps one of my biggest concern is with all this is with the influence that we're still allowing large entities to have over us. And that's very general. I want to explain it a little bit. I'm going to use an example. In the Commonwealth of Kentucky, the General Assembly and the Senate can send a proposed amendment to Kentucky's Constitution, to referendum. That's a general vote on the regular ballot to determine whether the amendment passes. Now, there were two on this year's ballot in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, Amendment 1 and 2. That's all they were called. Amendment 1 was mainly a change to parliamentary procedure, redefining how long the General Assembly and the Senate would go into legislative session. And the main change, and the one that was most significant to this, is it would allow the General Assembly and the Senate to call themselves into special session. Kentucky is one of the few states that does not have a provision for the legislature to call itself into special session. The governor is the only one that has the power to do that. Now, that was particularly important after our so-called Governor Andy Beshear, already a pretty unpopular governor, I'm just going to throw that out there, took advantage of the legislative session just ending before the revelation of COVID to tyrannize the people of Kentucky in many ways before the next legislative session came along. And there was really nothing the legislature could do. Beshear refused to call them into special session, although they requested multiple times that he do so. and so the legislature was effectively powerless until the session finally came back in. Situation somewhat more complicated than that, but that's a story for another time. I'm not getting into that right now. That was what Amendment 1 was, and I'll explain why it kind of makes sense it didn't pass. Amendment 2 was a simple change to Kentucky's constitution that would explicitly state that abortion was not protected in any area of Kentucky's constitution. Now, Kentucky already has some of the strictest abortion laws in the country, but with the reversal of the Roe versus Wade decision, almost any serious legal challenge to the current abortion restrictions, or most that would be passed or might be passed in the future. So in effect, it was to eliminate a lot of the legal attacks on the current anti-abortion legislation in Kentucky's law books. However, and I already said Amendment 1 didn't pass, but Amendment 2 didn't pass either. Amendment 1 is fairly understandable. It was a long motion, which at some point you should see or have seen on the screen. It was a long motion that was written fairly confusingly. Plus, there were concerns from some that would have supported limiting Beshear's power, or limiting the power of the governor's office in general, that even though it might limit that, giving the legislature the power to do that sort of thing could be a mistake, and could be where the legislature ends up doing the same thing that Beshear did. So there was some serious concerns, even from people that wanted that kind of motion. It was written very confusingly. It kind of makes sense that it didn't pass. And both of them were fairly close. Amendment 2, however, is a different story. Again, hopefully you will see this right about now on the screen. It was very simple. It was maybe 3 sentences. Very simply written overall, especially for something like a state legal document, which tends to be kind of convoluted anyway. And understand that most of Kentucky is anti-abortion to one degree or another. You can look at our voting records, you can look at our abortion laws. There's only one abortion slaughterhouse in the entire state currently. It's just not popular here. There used to be 2 here, but then under Governor Matt Bevin, there was some other anti-abortion legislation passed that was able to get one to shut down. As far as I know, none have ever opened back up. There's just one in the entire state. Amendment 2, as I mentioned, was quite simple, as you all have seen. However, it seems that most Kentuckians were very confused as to what Amendment 2 was, what it actually addressed, what it actually did. There was a massive, and I mean massive, disinformation campaign about Amendment 2. Lie after lie after lie was told. It was absolutely awful. I saw the stuff constantly. It was ridiculous. Plus, in general, people just had a hard time understanding what the amendment actually did, and I don't know exactly what all the reasons were. It seems to me that it was a mixture of gullibility and ignorance that caused the measure to fail. People kind of believed what some of the ads were saying, and also just were ignorant in understanding it. That's so far all I can come up with. And just frankly, I'm disappointed that Kentuckians had the wool pulled over their eyes in that way. It's sad. I'm disappointed. And I think it's something that is one of the more concerning things out of this election, frankly. Kentucky is not the only state that had these cryptically worded or massively misportrayed measures passed or failed when they shouldn't have. I can speak more directly to this Kentucky issue, and it goes to a deeper issue when it comes to people not understanding legal stuff. It's not always their fault, but we also have the responsibility to make up deficiencies wherever we can, and this is something that should have never gotten passed. We need to wake up, and we need to pay attention. And that's kind of the problems that I saw more from this issue with these amendments in Kentucky. And again, other places had similar problems. And again, this is a state thing. This is not national. This is not federal. This is a state issue. And yet these sorts of issues, these amendments to the Constitution, got tongue-tied again there. These small, relatively small state legislative motions and these little laws that maybe get put to referendum or just are passed because of a Republican that was elected or a Democrat that was elected, depending on whether they're good or bad. These sorts of things have a massive effect on you directly, on our everyday lives, and in some cases, depending on what we're talking about, may have a direct effect on things like elections. And this is something that we need to pay attention to. We can never underestimate, never downplay the importance of state and local elections and understanding ballot measures like Amendment 1 and Amendment 2. So finally, from this election, we get our marching orders. We need to realize that nothing is a given. This is just some of my takeaways from this election. Nothing is a given. We cannot take anything for granted when it comes to the direction that this country is going. We cannot expect, and I think you all would understand that we can't expect 110 plus years of entrenched power, corruption, and money to give up easily, to give up without a fight. They are going to fight back. They're going to do what they can to win. We don't need to give up. We need to understand that they are going to fight. We need to fight too. We need to inform ourselves, take the time to do that, and take the time to inform others where we can. Make sure that you don't think, never give into the thinking that you're too stupid to understand what is going on politically, to understand these ballot measures, to understand these election things, whatever the case might be. If anyone is trying to convince you that you're too stupid or there's some other reason that you can't understand what's going on politically, they're selling you a bill of goods. You need to understand that. You can understand it. You can know what's going on. You can have an informed opinion, and you need to put the effort in to do it. Again, we can't take anything for granted, and this election showed that. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be a quick process to fix the problems that we've got going on. And maybe we let our guard down a little bit this election. I don't know. It could be possible. We certainly put up some pretty weak candidates from the Republican Party. And the state of the Republican Party is a different issue in and of itself. But it is related to this for sure. We need to pay attention to the voter integrity legislation and actions that are being taken on state and local levels. That's all I'm going to say about that for the sake of YouTube. And we need to get motivated. The mainline establishment Republican Party is just as corrupt and just as sinister as the Democrats. And they are coming for us. They're coming for our families, our children, and they're coming for our freedom. And we need somebody to fight this evil off with our help. Whoever the president is, whoever the governor is, whatever, we need to be right there with them, standing against this tide of evil. And we need to be motivated to do that. This affects all of us. We've got a solid groundwork moving forward. I honestly believe that we do. We need to pray. We need to look to God. And let's march to victory, folks. I am by no means scared for the direction of this country. I don't think that we've lost. I don't think it's time to give up. I think it's time we grit our teeth, we buckle down, and we fight harder. That's what I think. I hope that's what you think. That's just the way it is. It's not even what I think. That's the way it is. We need to buckle up. We need to grit our teeth, and we need to work. We need to be motivated. There is hope. It is by no means a lost cause, and we need to march forward to victory. And I believe absolutely that we can. Now, I don't want to be stereotypical. This is the first video, so I'm definitely going to mention it now. Liking this video, subscribing to Rumble and YouTube, making sure your notifications are on. I know on YouTube, Rumble's a little weird with the way they do that. But all those different things helps our visibility a lot, helps me to get the Kentuckian out to more people. And it makes sure that you stay notified of new content. Make sure you comment. If you have questions, comments, just things that you thought of, whatever, those really help with visibility as well. And I'd love to hear from you all as well, too. There are many other ways to help the Kentuckian and help make a difference in general. If you want, we have the merch store now. We've got some cool merchandise on there. That's linked on our social media sites, and I'm going to put it in the description of this video at least. But there's some great stuff you can get there that I think you all will really like, but also it does help fund the Kentuckian as well. And if you'd like to help in a more personal way, as well as get access to more exclusive sneak peeks as to what's going on with the Kentuckian, if you would like to get maybe some special discounts and some insider info on the Kentuckian, and hopefully more to come as I develop out my Patreon more. My Patreon is listed in the description below. You can support me there, get access to some unique stuff, and I'm hoping, like I said, to expand that as I go along. And you can help me in a more personal way, which I hope is perhaps interesting to you. But all that said, I want you to remember, friends, always remember that as long as you and I are doing what's right, we make a real difference in this old world. This has been Ryan Dalton of the Kentuckian, signing off.